Mark Giovanni here, Symphonic Virtual Orchestration, with another video for the series of interviews to composers in the LA scene. Today we've got the great pleasure of having a British composer, David Buckley, who's he's been working for the last Jason Bourne movie. He's been actively working on the Good Fight. David moved to LA like 10 years ago, something like that?
10 years, yeah.
Well, Dave, thanks for your time.
Thanks
today.
for having me. It's great to see you.
Let's jump right into it. I've got a question from Andrew Perry, Stanford, Maine, and he's asking, so how did you get started?
It's quite a sort of unlikely journey to LA that I took. I think it just goes to show that you never quite know, you can be doing something and it can take you somewhere completely different. And my something was cathedral church music in England. So I was aged around 9, between the ages of 9 and 13, I was singing as a choir boy. And it was standard stuff, singing the services in church. We did a little bit of touring, a little bit of recording. But a couple of things happened. First of all, we sang on a soundtrack to The Last Temptation of Christ, the Scorsese film, which Peter Gabriel wrote the score. And I remember this left and I didn't see the film, I was too young and it was quite controversial, but the idea that music and something else could sort of merge sort of fascinated this young mind. I remember just really loving the experience. And then secondly, perhaps more crucially, or perhaps in addition to that, a adult singer came into the choir fairly briefly. He was sort of in between jobs, and his name was Harry Gregson Williams. So I think he was teaching in Egypt, and then he sang in the choir for 6 or so months, and then went off and did other things. And I didn't really get to know him, but I mean, yeah, I did get to know him, but only in the sense that, I was a younger person, he was an old person. So all this is a preamble to saying that there were these couple of things. Harry went on, as we all know, to be a A-list composer, and he mentored me when I moved here, and is a very good friend of mine now. So basically, at this young age, all these events happened. I carried on studying music, sort of serious, proper music. But I think it dawned on me probably by my early 20s that I wanted to pursue the commercial side of things. And I was very fortunate that I was able to get in touch with Harry many, many, many years later. And he was, great in sort of helping me sort of establish myself over here.
So the message here would be that you have to plan ahead. Like at 9 years old, you should be planning to become a film composer.
I mean, planning ahead is obviously a good thing. I think perhaps the more important message is sort of what I said at the beginning, is that you never quite know. I've spoken to people who are, perhaps they play instruments and they have, they're all-round musicians, and they're saying to me, oh, well, should I stop playing my instrument and concentrate more on composition? And I've often said, don't narrow your scope too early, because you never really know. I know some people who string players who were playing in sessions, and all of a sudden someone said, oh, actually, we need a string arrangement. Is anyone here doing it? And they said, oh yeah, I can do it. So they went up, did a quick string arrangement, recorded it, and then these people have sort of blossomed from there and have gone on to do bigger and more impressive things. So I think there's an obvious route, which is I want to be a composer, therefore I will buy this computer, this software, and I will do everything in my power to become a composer. There's the less obvious route, which is you can't ignore that side of things, but what else? What sort of broadens your prospects and makes you, a little bit different to another person? So I think, yeah, the message would be that from a pretty little provincial cathedral city in the southwest of England, I met Harry Gregson Williams, and 2 decades later, completely strange turn of events. I worked for him, and then he, helped me get a career.
Yeah, totally. You never know.
You never know. That's you've summed it up in 3 words.
I get this question from many students. How do I get a job, right?
Yeah,
and usually my answer is, it's different for everyone.
It is totally.
You try, because when you're always trying to get a better project, and you're trying to study what others did so you can replicate it and hopefully get a better. But it's different for everyone.
Yeah. I think don't. we all, yeah, absolutely. We're the sum of all our influences. We look at how this person works, and it informs us. But I think it's vital that we all know that our journey is going to be unique. There are things that we'll share in common, but and you have to have confidence to know that as well. You can't, if you sort of slavishly follow what this person does, it's probably not going to work for you. You may think that you're on a secure path, but you have to slightly, you have to just sort of be assured in yourself that if you've got the raw goods, if you're talented, if you're personable, if you work hard,
Exactly.
you've got to be confident that it's that it will pan out with a lot of difficulty along the way. It's not easy.
It takes time.
It takes a lot of time.
You have to just keep going or stay where you
are.
Yeah. I've got actually had let's change the order of the questions because there's a couple of questions that it's from Sean Burke, New Jersey, and Wesley from Malaysia. And it's about that. It's because question regarding how to find opportunities in film scoring, and some people they just they aren't in LA, but they want to become film composers. So the question is for those of us who are not or do not live in or near LA, what do you recommend as far as other methods in networking and also getting or samples of work out there? And he's wondering about maybe recommendations, websites, or maybe other media, YouTube videos or student films. They are really starting and.
Yep. Well, when I was giving my previous answer, I kind of missed a big chunk out. It didn't just go from me leaving college and then me moving here. There was a whole decade I spent in London before I actually was able to get back in touch with Harry again, before it even dawned on me to come over here just as a visit and try and meet up with people. So there was 10 years spent in London. So I'd graduated, I had a music degree, and I was combining the things that I really enjoyed, which was teaching, performing, and singing, and composing. And I was, keeping all those things up in the air and dividing my time between that. In terms of the composing, what was I going to do? I knew I didn't want to be a concert composer. I knew I wanted to move into this. So the first things I did were, as you just pointed out, student films. I mean, I was told to do this and it made a lot of sense. I went round to the film schools in London and I put little signs up with, here's my mobile number. And I pretty much did anything I was asked. I probably did a dozen, if not more, short films. Some of them were good, most of them were naive, shall we say. But it was a good start for me because, I didn't really know what I was doing. Someone had made a moving image that I could write music to, so I thought, why not? I would learn, even if I had a piece of music that wasn't very good at the end of it, or it was a film that wasn't particularly great or inspiring, I knew I was going to gain something from it. Exactly. And the second point about that, of course, is that you never know where those filmmakers are going to end up. They could become the next Chris Nolan. You never quite know. I don't think any of the ones I work with have become particularly celebrated, but for one guy, I did a couple of short films, and he actually did a feature which I couldn't actually do in the end because I was clashing with something else. But we all want to, we'd all love to say, I want to work with Scorsese or with Nolan or with anyone. But obviously, we need to be pragmatic, and it's good as when you're starting out, find the filmmakers who are also starting out, find the editors, find the producers, all the people who are at the same stage of things as you are. And I remember, I'm sure there's millions more, but there were websites which I remember I used to look at something called Shooting People in the UK, and that listed all these sort of low budget, independent student films, short films, low budget features. So there must be a wealth of information like that on the internet now. I think another thing is because of the sort of the world we live in and the way that the internet has really changed the way so many things work, I think using that to one's advantage. I've heard of composers who weren't particularly well established, but they've put something out on YouTube. Mm-hmm. Let's just say it's a piece of music, or it's a piece of music they've written to a video, and they've gone viral, millions of hits. And I've heard in a few instances that there have been some filmmakers who have actually spotted people in that regard again, it's that not really knowing how fate is going to play out.
But it's the same thing than composing for a director. You never know if this guy is going to become the next big shot.
Right. It's putting your faith into something. So I think there are tools out there which are, and excuse me, and the internet is obviously one that you can't ignore. Now, of course, the first thing I did was commercials, and it was a friend who, again, this wasn't how it was supposed to play out, but this is what happened. A friend, I didn't really know him at the time, he was a guitarist and a keyboard player, good composer, a guy called Keith Bailey. He wanted to know a little bit more about the orchestral side of things. So he said to me, can you teach me? We tried to do some music theory stuff, and I think we sort of realised fairly quickly that this was probably a bit boring and that there might be a more exciting way of doing it. And he said, well, look, I get commercials. Why don't we do them together when it's appropriate? I'll do the electronic side of things. You can do the orchestral side of things, or whatever. We can switch it up. But why not sort of get involved? So we did this for probably about 10 years, and we did lots of commercials. I mean, some shampoos and toilet paper, really glamorous things.
Yeah.
But again, it was great. And, I learnt how to get a musical idea out very, very quickly. So that was a chance meeting. I had another chance meeting where someone said, do you know how to write music for theme parks? I said, nope. But I sort of hung out with these people, saw what they were doing, and I started writing music for some of the big theme parks in England. So again, none of these make me a film composer, but they were just quirky little steps.
Well, yeah, you have to learn to walk before you run, those are all great opportunities, especially the student fields. But if you mess up, it's not
the big deal. Yeah. And at that stage, it was a case of me saying yes to everything. Mm-hmm. I've tried. I mean, I still, whenever I get approached about anything, I look at it and try and think: is this something I can do? Is it something I have time to do? Is it something that's valuable? I try and always look at not just the obvious. I'm not just looking at the money or the prestige. I'm trying to look beyond that. Mm-hmm. But certainly back then when I started, it was find what's out there and embrace it.
You mentioned something that I wanted to bring up, which is 10 years. You mentioned that twice. And 10 years, it seems like, I was making my best and trying and doing stuff during 10 years, and finally I got this movie. Well, 10 years is a lot of time. And sometimes when we start, we are like, I've been 2 years here, 3 years, and I still didn't get anything. Well, it may take time. Oh. And 10 years, when someone explaining their story, it's like I stayed here 10 years, but 10 years is a lot of time. We've got to realize that it takes time for everything. Usually we don't know anything about a composer up until they get this big movie, and we think it's they got lucky, but it's not lucky. This guy has done so many things in the past.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think there is a case of being in the right place at the right time. I mean, there's some things that you just can't control.
Yeah.
There are things that you can control, and I think those are the things you need to concentrate on, which are, your ability to write good music that works for film, and your ability to be a team player, work with people, and when you get told by someone that they don't like the piece of music, not to have a breakdown, but be able to fairly swiftly pick yourself up and move on. These are things. It's not that I'm necessarily a perfectionist at any of those things. I think I've worked at them, but I know I've worked at them. I've worked very hard at those things, and all the other things like, why does this person get the job and not me? There's nothing I can do about that. That's worrying about that is sort of something that's bad use of time. So for sure, yeah, it's not just nothing just got plonked on my plate. I had to, but I will say I was lucky that I had this relationship with Harry.
Well, definitely. But you were ready and prepared, so when it
I was ready and prepared. Yeah, I worked for Harry for about a year and a half, and I worked very, very hard. It was the kind of way that a lot of A-list composers work. We were working 7 days a week. I had wasn't like, tonight I'm going to go to the theatre or tonight I'm going to go to cinema. You never knew how late you were going to stay. It was a grueling schedule. I mean, I loved it. It wasn't like I felt like I was like a slave or anything. It's absolutely what I wanted to do. I'd been curious about film music, and suddenly here I was with an opportunity to work in a vibrant, thriving community that was Harry's studio at the time. It was absolutely everything I wanted. I mean, that year and a half I worked for him, it felt like it went by in days, actually, because it was just, I was absorbing so much information and learning so much.
Which brings me to the second question, because at some point during that time, it came an opportunity. It's a question from Yi Tong Chen from Oklahoma, and he's asking about so how did you get to score The Forbidden Kingdom, which is a story that I love.
Have I told you this story?
Yeah.
I hope my story is still the same. I hope you can tell me
I'll
about.
fake it. I'll fake it. It's not the same.
You're just nodding like, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is another example of how you think, you're going down this path and then it makes a weird turn. So I was helping Harry out on a film called The Number 23. Is this the story? Yeah. And it was sort of first time I'd done anything that was kind of really electronic and dark and noirish. Everything I'd done before for Harry had been more sort of animation, and this was definitely going in a slightly different path. Again, it felt great. I didn't, it was learning on the job, but I really liked it. Now, I remember working on one scene, and I went down this very odd route, and I can't really tell you why I went down this route, but I started using, I found this collection of erhu recordings, this Chinese instrument, and I started using them, and I sort of cut them up a little bit and put delays and reverbs on it, and I thought it sounded quite good. Harry sort of, when I played it to him, he was sort of scratching his head thinking, this film isn't set in China. But eventually, he thought, but it's quite interesting. So I think eventually it was played to the director, and I think the director said something along the lines of, well, if we did this, we sort of have to change the whole musical landscape of the film, and I don't think we're going to do that. So it was like, thank you, but no thank you. So the piece was consigned to the back of the hard drive. But the music editor on that film, Adam Smalley had heard the piece, and I think he said, oh, that's a nice piece. And then a year later or whatever, this Chinese film came up, and he called me and he goes, do you remember that thing? And I said, yeah. And he goes, can you send it to me? Send it to me. He had the picture, and he goes, God, this could be really interesting. So he sort of started to make, I wasn't going to be an obvious candidate. I hadn't scored a film at this point, but because I'd worked on this other film with this curious piece of music, it sort of meant that there was a little bit of interest. The filmmaker said, okay. Now then I had to properly prove my worth, and I had to write a demo. They sent me a big scene. Well, yeah, it was quite a big scene, a big, expansive, beautiful shot of ancient China and some sort of battle thing, and I had to write a 3 or 4 minute demo for that. So it wasn't just like they heard this thing and said, there's the job, go and record it. It was more like, okay, this is a foot in the door, which I wouldn't have got, without having done that. So again, a very unlikely, sequence of events, but I mean, it just goes to show, you never know.
There's another one from Yi Tong, and he's asking, at your time at Cambridge, what did you focus musically on? Composition, orchestration, etc. What was the more vital experience that you had there? Did you work more harder, or?
Well, it was a fairly straight down the line academic course. There weren't many. I guess there was a little element of performance which I didn't do, but there was musical analysis, counterpoint and harmony, history papers, theory papers. So it was very, like you'd find, it wasn't a music conservatoire. It was very much rigorous academic pursuit. Now, I thought at the time that this was probably, because I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do, but this felt, for my kind of, everything that I'd done up to date, this felt like the obvious sort of way to conclude my studies, just giving me a sort of all-round nuts and bolts musical experience. It did cross my mind that I would leave there, and was it going to be of any use? Was there anything that I would have learned there really going to have a practical, unless I did really want to become a full-time teacher, which I didn't. I enjoyed teaching, but I didn't want to do that full-time. I wasn't quite sure what any of this would lead to. But you never know, because one thing I really enjoyed doing when I was at Cambridge was writing. We had to write a fugue in my final year. We had to write a fugue in the style of Bach. So we literally had 3 hours to sit in a room, and they gave you, I think, a choice of 5 fugal subjects, and then without a piano, you just had to sit there and write a 4-part fugue on paper. And you practice that over 3 years. And I think that was one thing I enjoyed more than anything, because anyone can read books and write an essay, and frankly, who cares what a 21-year-old thinks about anything? I mean, you're just regurgitating facts. But the fugue was something that you could actually get better at, and I think I did get better at it. I think it was one paper I did quite well in. And it's actually something that served me quite well, because once in a while, on a few things, I've been able to write music which is more contrapuntal, and having those skills that I learnt in Cambridge has been able for me to do that fairly quickly. You know, a lot of film music, you know, there's diverse styles in film music. You know, I've written stuff which is very simple and drony, and, you know, one notes with a little twinkle of a piano, and then I've written stuff which is quite complex and contrapuntal, and I think that was what Cambridge actually. That's
great. Actually, I've got a question that relates to this one. Matteo Cremolini from Italy, and he's asking about Fellon's Fugue, which it's a track for The Good Wife.
Yeah.
So maybe that was an opportunity to bring that. His question is, how did you get to write something like that? Do you approach it in your sequencer? Do you write some? I see that you've got some sketches there. Do you sit in the piano first, or how does this go?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because for some of the students, it's a bit overwhelming sitting in front of MIDI regions and lines and rectangles and not seeing the notes.
Yes. Well, you know, it varies. I mean, I'm trying to remember how that piece started. As a rule of thumb, if I'm working on something that's more musical and less sound designy, I probably will have a piano upstairs, and I probably will sit at the piano. Mm-hmm. If it's more sort of produced electronic stuff, I'm going to probably more likely sit here, because, you know, I don't know what benefit there's going to be from a piano. I can't remember exactly with that piece, but I do remember. I'm sure I would have started it on paper, mm-hmm. and sort of figured out how am I going to get, you know, subject, answer, subject, and the counterpoint. But then, you know, then the temptation is to take it into here because you want to hear how it sounds. And I think, definitely I started it on paper, and then when I had enough sort of fleshed out, I wanted to, not only did I want to hear it sound, I also needed to see how it was working with the picture. It was quite a weird, I mean, the way that I've ended up scoring The Good Wife in recent years, well, we finished now, but the last couple of seasons is sort of, it's not very conventional, using this sort of quasi-classical Baroque music on top of a very contemporary TV show. But to me, that's when it actually became interesting, because prior to that, I was writing sort of a mainstream TV score, standard kind of stuff, quite subtle. And this suddenly felt, wow, okay, this is a bit odd. This doesn't really, should this really be here? But it sort of worked in a strange way. And so I remember when I had that scene to write, it was one of those scenes where there was a lot of energy, and they were moving furniture from one office to another. And so typically, you know, you'd probably, if you weren't scoring it like that, you might score it with some sort of percussion and sort of motor. And I thought, well, how do I do that, but in a slightly odd way, in a slightly different way? And I thought, a fugue, that's, you know, passing of time, like energy. And I didn't have very long to do it. I remember my mum was staying here at the time, and I remember I said, I've got to go. It was a Saturday morning. I said, I've got to go into the studio. I've got to write this thing. I said, come in 4 hours and I'll play you something. So 4 hours is one hour longer than it used to take me at Cambridge, but I'm getting older. So yeah, paper, figure it out, and then get it in there. And I do remember, though, I was pulling things around, and I was thinking, okay, that doesn't quite, is that a new part? And then I copy and paste and put it onto a violin part. In many ways, it was a little bit inelegant, but when I actually got to recording it and putting it on paper, you know, spitting it out and putting it all on paper, then I really traced the lines and made sure it was made proper musical sense. When it was in there, it sounded okay, but it was a bit kind of like a line would start, then it would sort of fizzle out and didn't really conclude, which isn't, you know, Bach would turn in his grave.
Well, you used your classical training that you had, and then used the modern tools to adapt.
It was a combination, and that means, because that isn't always musical, what you see on the screen. I mean, it's, you know, it isn't. It's blocks of notes. So in many ways, I needed both these worlds of paper, well, actually piano, paper, and that to kind of make a piece like that come alive. And I would move, fairly swiftly between the three things to make sure it was, working.
That leads me to another question from Jacqueline Peria, Victoria, Canada. And she's asking, as a musician with a classical background, I'm wondering how I can start incorporating modern music like synths and beats to my compositions.
Well, I think it's a good thing that she's asking, because I believe that it's important to sort of be as well-rounded as possible. Not that you need to say, I can write in every single style under the sun, but if you go to the cinema, there is even, scores which are predominantly symphonic. You often hear some kind of electronic element in the background. It's definitely a thing that producers and filmmakers are interested in, and rightly so, because the world of film has opened up. It's not just John Williams. There are many other options out there now. So I came like the person who asked the question. I came from a classical background, and I guess I started off by there are great pieces of software which we all know. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine being a sort of professional composer and not using or having Omnisphere. Even now, if I've got kids are just managed to put the kids to sleep and everyone's asleep, I might just sort of get on the internet and sort of search for unusual little boutique companies who make a specific synth or a specific plugin or something, and some of them are really inexpensive. And then, to me, there's no other way of figuring this out apart from putting it in your system and mucking around with it. I don't read the instructions. I'm too lazy. It just doesn't have any charisma for me at all, looking at an instruction manual. So I'll put it in, I'll play it, I'll go through the presets, change it, move dials. Do I like it? Yeah. Do I not like it? No. Why don't I like it? Is it bad, or is it because I don't know how to use it?
Can I tweak it, maybe?
Yeah, can I tweak it? Can I change it? What happens if I put this plugin plus this plugin on a sound plus this plugin? It's unlike, there are harmonic conventions that, if you've studied classical music, there are rules. Whether you wish to embrace those rules or not is entirely any composer's preference. But I think in the world of electronic music, I'd say there probably aren't rules. There are some conventions that have sort of filtered down into film music, but I think that there's so many, the parameters are so different. And so I think the sort of scope for experimentation, I've gone backwards and forwards over the years, whether I didn't have any hardware synths at all, but then I bought a few, then I sold them all because I thought it's a pain, but then I've sort of reinvested in a little bit, got some over there and some pedals and things over here. And this, I wouldn't say that, I'm an expert at any of them, but it gives me the opportunity to turn dials and see what happens.
That's nice. Yeah, that's a question from Matthew, Michigan. The question was very direct and maybe naive. It's why do you have them instead of using the computer ones, which are easier?
Yeah.
How do you find the time to program those?
It's a very good question. And actually, I can give you an answer from this weekend. I had to write some pieces. I was trying to demo for a film, which they wanted a very, very electronic score. Now, I've written a lot of what has become known as sort of hybrid, strings plus electronics, but I really haven't written much stuff which is purely electronic. And I wanted to get some pieces ready. I wanted to do something. So my initial instinct was, well, I've got these hardware synths, let's start using them. There wasn't the time. I needed to get these pieces. I had to write 6 or so minutes of music, 3 different pieces, which I wanted to change. I wanted
in a weekend.
In a weekend, and I wanted to work on it. Well, typically, what I like to do is work on something and then stop working on it, go and watch a film, have a glass of wine, whatever, and then open the sequence again and see, 24 hours later, do I still like it, or is it absolute rubbish? Now, I can't do that with those because the recallability just isn't there.
Yeah.
So in that instance, it was software synths.
Exactly.
And I had no problem with it. I think they sounded good. I was using a lot of the Zebra UHI, which is, Hans has said it's the only synth he uses. I can completely understand why. It's fantastic. Now, if I've got more time, if I'm on a film, let's say, and there's that glorious moment you hope that you have when you're scoring a film where you've got weeks of, experimentation, trying things, going a little bit wrong, going a little bit crazy, then I'd be more inclined to run things through pedals and get my hands dirty over there. Now, 90% of what I try over there would be utterly horrendous and unusable. But you just hope there's a sort of 10% of things that say, oh, that's pretty cool. And it feels, I think it feels, this could be nonsense, because one could really make the argument that what software synths and hardware synths, you could fool people and maybe you wouldn't know the difference. For me, it's the other reason why there's an instrument over there I've got called a guitar viol. It's just something that I bow. I put it through a reverb and I put it through a delay. I would never ever want anyone to come in the room and for me to play it, because it's not very good. But when I've put it through there, it's got some inaccuracies. MIDI is very precise,
Exactly.
but all this stuff, the analog stuff, and that is an element of sort of unpredictability towards it, and I like having that just at the left side of me in case that's where I want to go. There's sometimes where you want absolute digital precision, and you know how to do that. That just gives me another area. But the guy asked the question, to get something decent out of these things is hard work. It's not, but there's, I mean, okay, you can go to a preset, just go boom, 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 boom. But to actually get something where it really works with a piece of music you're writing,
Exactly. As you mentioned, there aren't that many conventions there, as for example in Harmony. And
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
It takes more time.
It definitely, and I think it's good, even if you don't want to write as an upcoming composer, even if that isn't your thing, you don't want to do electronic stuff. I'm often a little sort of saddened when I hear people sort of dismiss electronic scores as being easy and anyone can do it. I mean, as we've just said, it's hard to do something convincing. In fact, I just watched Patriots Day, the Pete Berg movie, and it was Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross who scored it. And to me, it was just a textbook score. It was all done with synths, and those guys have got every synth under the sun and every pedal and effects thing. But it was just perfect. It was so good. And I read a couple of reviews. I should not read reviews, but I read a couple of reviews, people saying, it was boring, it was drony, where was the tune, where was the orchestra? I was thinking, I don't want a tune. Does the Marathon Bomber deserve a tune? I don't think so. This to me was subtle, grown-up adult scoring, and it was done by people who really know their craft when it comes to synths. And I think that whether you choose whether you want to do that or not, I think at the very least composers should, and preferably even fans of film music, should be able to kind of understand that there are many, many different ways to do this.
Exactly.